So today I'm going to be taking a look at a watch from the Merkur watch group under the name Guilberlin. It's a pretty cool watch. I think that comes in at a pretty great price, so let's take a closer look. Just as a note, the watch was given to the channel by the Merkur group on AliExpress, but I don't have to let them review the video first. They don't have any input on what's said in the video. I just thankfully get the watch to be able to review, and then it was given away on my Patreon channel, so if you're interested in watches given away in the future, check that out. So we have a diameter of 38 millimeters, lug to lug of 44.6, height of only 9 millimeters, and a lug width of 20 millimeters. Some other general specifications for the watch: we're going to have a hardlex crystal on the watch here with a little bit of a box shape and very gentle dome. We have 50 meters of stated water resistance with just a regular push-pull crown. You can see we have a closed case back with just some general info on it, but I'll open it in a second. Here we see the Seagull ST17 manual wind movement. It does just seem like they took off a rotor from this movement to make it a manual wind variation. I don't mind that. One, because it's not open, so you don't see this ugly unfinished part where there used to be gears and rotors and whatnot. But I like how thin they were able to make it. This is one of the thinnest watches I've gotten that's mechanical from AliExpress, and it's fun to see. It wears really well. And lastly, this watch retails for $88, which is fantastic. I think this is a great option to exist at that under $100 price range. And really cool for someone's maybe first mechanical watch, or maybe their first intro into thinner mechanical hand winds. So yeah, let's take a closer look at everything else. Starting off with the dial, and I do like most of what's going on here. They went for a very Art Deco styling. They have a bunch of circles and sectors to the dial itself. We have this syringe style hand done in this blue treatment. These do have a blue tone, which kind of shows that they are painted or lacquered in some way rather than blued, but I don't mind. It still does look good on the watch, and I can't knock them for that. We have classic blocky style Arabic numerals all around for each hour, and the part that I start not liking here is they are done in this very green leaning Lume signature. If they did just regular printed numerals, I think that would have looked amazing. But here we have this, green tone introduced to the watch, which I don't love. But all the other colors are very nice. We have this very muted orange tone on the inner central ring, the inner ring for the sub-seconds, and the outer seconds track. We of course have this white ring breaking up for both the regular hours track and the seconds track. We have the white strap, which it comes naturally optioned on, which gives it this kind of very fun retro 70s feel to it. The text is also kept very minimally, which I like. We have just Guilberlin at the very top at 12. Kind of an interesting name, but I actually don't mind it. It doesn't feel overly like AI created in a sense. It feels like some kind of regular name, obviously not based off of anything from Berlin or anything like that, but I don't mind the name. I really like how all the tones they went for are very matte and muted for the most part. This isn't a bright and summery kind of orange tone. This isn't a super blinding white. They all feel very nice and they play together very well. Again, I do think if this green tone was gone, it'd look much more cohesive, but you can play around with straps to make it feel more homogeneous with that green tone. Zooming in on the watch here, and I think this watch is executed to a standard better than you would expect for this $100 price point. Now, I think they probably do a couple tricks to get around that, like they don't use polished metal hands, which could probably show marks and scratches a little bit better. They don't use metal applied indices, which would be the same case. But even then, the printing is done very well. We can see the base dial color of the orange has this slight eggshell texture about it, which is cool. It just adds a little bit of visual play that probably doesn't overly shine or is overly noticeable from wrist view, but probably adds a little bit to that matteness or the way that it reflects light in a sense. So cool to see that little texture added. It is not there for the white portions. Those are kind of just kind of pure flat white. We do see every now and then there's like a little misprint, like there's a black near the 1 there. Towards the 6 o'clock, there's that little speck near the seconds track. There's also like a little speck there between the 8 and the 7, and also the 8 and the 9. So again, this is a watch under $100. You're going to find these little tiny QC issues because, well, it's not the most expensive watch on the planet. You don't see any of these specs or quote-unquote issues from the wrist when you're wearing it, so I think it still is a nice package overall. I also do really like how they outlined all the numerals and just gives it this little extra depth. Looking at the hands themselves, you can see there is a little bit of damage near the base hand stack and a little bit of almost dimpling towards the base of that hour hand. They do also just have this overall plasticky look about them. When, to be fair, that might be what they're made out of, but it doesn't really look overly cheap or badly done when you're wearing it, so I don't mind it. You can see the seconds hand a slight bit cleaner, but there's almost like a chipping or missing of the paint near the end, the tail end of that seconds hand. Overall, I think it's a lovely dial. There's a lot of nice details, and I think they did a really good job with the printing and the color and the separation of the colors. But of course, the tiny little cutesy things here that need to be shaped up on. And realistically, since this watch is quote-unquote so affordable, it's one of those ones where you could attempt to try to take apart the watch and clean up the dial yourself, and could be a fun little watchmaking activity as well. Taking a look at the watch in natural light, you can see it can be a little bit reflective, but it's really not that bad at all. I don't think they really use any air coating, but again, not too big of a deal. The watch also doesn't really change much outside. It's kind of more of a matte dial, so the colors retain most of their depth or kind of lack of at certain points. It still is just orange. You still get that green tone that pops out from that lume. But I mean, it still looks very clean and crisp outside, which I do like. Moving into more direct sunlight, the watch really doesn't change that much either. It's kind of just what you see is what you get. It stays the same at pretty much all angles. You get a little bit of color variation at extreme angles. It goes a little darker. But other than that, it still looks pretty good and pretty consistent, and nothing feels cheap in direct sunlight, which is nice. Moving on to the case of this watch, and while they kept it fairly simple, I think it's actually executed pretty nicely. Not only, again, do we have the very nice profile, the slimness, the very tiny mid case, but I think the finishing is actually done pretty well. We have from the top part mostly polishing, just high polish on all the lugs. The bezel itself though, thin but also circularly grained, which is nice to see. The sides of the case itself has a horizontal brushing. We don't have any chamfering or anything like that, but the transition from the brushing to the polish is actually pretty well done, pretty defined, doesn't look muddy or cheaply done. The brushing itself is done with a really fine grain and doesn't look overly machined or cheap. So there's a lot of nice elements about this watch, even down to the bezel, which is pretty thin at the top, but also steps down to a second layer, just a very tiny stepped bezel, which gives it this nice architectural feel, adds a little bit of depth to an otherwise pretty thin watch, and shows that there's attention to detail paid to this design. It's not just slapped together and really a bunch of parts just made to be as cheap as possible. There was some care taken to this. That comes down, I think, to the crown too. While small, it's definitely usable, it's definitely functional, and because this is a hand wind watch, you're gonna be needing to use that crown and needing to wind it. So it has a nice knurling, it has a good grip, you're able to absolutely wind the watch. So it's nice to see that these tiny little details are paid attention to. And again, I think this is a fantastic looking case for under $100, wears amazing on the wrist. You even have like these tiny little cuts on the edge of the lugs, or really a roundedness that slopes, and just gives this really unique stance on wrist. I just enjoy what they did to this case shape, and I think if they built off this platform, made other dial variations, maybe upgraded the movement type, they can have a very winning formula on their hands with this case and with this platform. If you compare it to other quote-unquote like micro brands I've looked at, I would say I prefer this case to Baltics that I've seen, and you know, those are around for $500–600, so it's one of those ones where this is definitely punching above its weight. I also do really like the inclusion of the slightly domed, slightly raised crystal, because for such a thin watch, I think adding that extra depth really helps the watch and not feel too thin or too delicate. This is the original strap it comes with, this very large grained, you know, quote unquote genuine leather strap. To be fair, one, it is pretty comfortable, but it's one of those things where it's a white strap. I think over time it will probably not age very gracefully, but you can mix this up with plenty of other straps and, you know, give it some new life there. But it's not bad that they didn't just completely cheap out and give you the worst quality strap ever imaginable. And of course, just like we got a look at the movement earlier, this is the plain case back, just a brushed finishing, a little bit more of a blasted version in the middle, which has the brand logo and then water resistant and some other general info. So moving on to how this watch wears, earlier I was wearing this Alto 8 here. Pretty fun watch. I'll probably release these two reviews together. This one is closer to 38.5mm, so you'll get an idea of size comparison. So here we have the watch sitting on my 6.5-inch wrist, and you can see it wears very well. It's very compact lug to lug. Again, it's super, super thin. I mean, the strap isn't super conforming, so you can see it's not wearing perfectly on my wrist. But if I batten it down a little bit, you can see wears perfectly onto the wrist. No really gap between the wrist and the case itself. So it's a very comfortable case. There's not really any harsh edges. It doesn't feel badly machined or badly cut. And I think just is very comfortable. You can kind of see from the side view there, the watch case kind of just ends up melting away into the wrist. Again, it's a very pleasurable watch to wear. I'm glad that they went for an under 40mm. I'm glad they went for this manual wind variation with this very thin case construction, because they could have absolutely done a manual wind and just made it a very blocky standard case and just made the manual wind aspect a feature, but I'm glad they didn't do that. I'm sure this was slightly more expensive to make it thinner and make it more elegant, but I'm glad they went that extra mile. So moving on to some other straps, and I think because we have this very muted orange tone, browns and kind of tan cognac colors end up working really beautifully with the watch. For example, this one actually is just another really cheapy strap off of AliExpress. I believe this was like $2 or $3, and I'll have it linked down below. But once you actually break it in, it's very comfortable. I wouldn't say this strap is probably gonna last you a lifetime, but it's very serviceable, especially if you want to keep this whole package very cheap. You can pick up this watch, you can pick up 2 or 3 fun straps, maybe even a cheap rubber strap as well from AliExpress, and you're still talking around $100, right? So it's a very cool package. It's something you can definitely give someone who's watch curious in your life, and I think it pairs well. Definitely changes it up, makes it a lot more serious in my opinion. I also don't overly notice the green lume in this version. To be fair, it's still there and I still wish it wasn't there, but it blends a little bit better, it hides a little bit better, which is nice to see. And then a side view with the strap that fits more conformingly. It just wears nicely on the wrist, very sleek, very low, and again, super comfy. Here is an example more of like, if you can't beat them, join them, one of those things. This is a nice textured green strap. I believe they call this like Mozart or something similar to that, from Has No Bounds, and it does match the green tone that lume is giving off pretty closely. So it is one of those things where, one, if you don't mind the green and orange combo, you can lean into that by putting it on a green strap, but also the green strap helps the green tone not feel so out of place. It has something else to complement off of, so definitely makes it a little louder, a little more fun, but I don't mind it. Again, green's one of my favorite colors, so it's kind of weird that I am so against green tones, but I just feel like it doesn't always complement well on the dial. Kind of moving the watch down a little bit, I have closer to a 6-inch wrist here below the bone, and I think you can see the watch still wears well. They did a good job with the case proportions, the 38, the short lug to lug, so this will definitely fit on a lot of wrist sizes pretty nicely. And now sticking with the original theme, but going a little bit towards my direction and taste, we have the white silicone strap. This one's not from Archer, it's from AliExpress. I'm kind of testing to see if these yellow as much as the Archer ones do, but we'll see. I think this is lovely looking. Again, it comes on a white strap, so it is kind of made for that. It makes it very fun, very summery, makes the colors pop. And I just do like that almost creamsicle kind of feel you get from the watch with the orange and the white. Arguably, I do think this is probably one of the better combos for the watch. It does seem pretty much made for, and that's probably why they went with the white strap originally. So yeah, get yourself a white silicone. So taking a look at the lume here, we can see it's not done badly. It is actually showing up a little brighter on camera than it does in person. So we have pretty consistent lume between the indices and the hands themselves. The hands are slightly brighter, but it's pretty legible. It doesn't last super long. It's not super bright to begin with, but at least it is very visible while it's on. Reluming it and comparing to the classic Timex, we can see the Timex much brighter, obviously just more surface area, but yeah, the Guilberlin could definitely take a little bit of a better application, a little bit stronger, and honestly, in my opinion, just not use lume at all. So pros and cons of the watch, and I think the biggest pro right off the bat is just gonna be the price. This comes in at just under $100 for a mechanical watch, which is getting harder to find these days, and it really kind of only exists on AliExpress at this point. But there are still some good value pieces for that price. This, I think, becomes very unique among not only AliExpress watches, not only watches under $100, but just kind of watches in general, because this becomes a sub 40 millimeter hand wound watch, which is still pretty thin and wears well on wrist. They did a really good job with the case dynamics and the dimensions. And although this might not be a pro for everybody, I particularly like the fact that they went for a dressier styled watch at this price point, because typically if you're talking about people making the affordable crowd pleaser, it's always a dive watch, it's always something sporty, so having something of the dressier category is really nice to see. So moving on to cons, and while there aren't a lot, especially for the price point, there is really just the fact that I don't think there's enough variation to this watch. You really only get either the orange or the blue dial colorway, and those might not appeal to everybody, especially since they both use that C3 kind of green leaning lume signature. I don't think it's exactly C3, but you get what I'm saying. I think a very classic black and white colorway, or a completely monotone, all black, all white, all silver, whatever kind of color neutral thing you want to go for, would work amazingly well here. And honestly, I just think if they built a platform off of this style and price point and case construction, it could be very interesting. Another con for me is going to be the lume on the dial, not only because it does have that green leaning tint when it's in sunlight, but because it's also just not good. It's one of those things where they could have just done completely printed numerals. They didn't have to use lume. It was just kind of like, in a sense, an afterthought, which does look good because it's nice and three-dimensional and puffy in a sense, but it also just is not very useful or practical because it dies very quickly. And other than that, two little slight cons to touch on is one, it would be nice to see sapphire crystal, but I understand if they can't do it for the price point, and I'm not too mad at that. But also, it would be nice to see the watch QC'd slightly better. Again, you're asking for a lot at this price point, but there's tiny little things where honestly, if you just took like a compressed air to the dial, it would look a little bit better because there's just tiny little marks here and there. But final thoughts, and I think they did an amazing job with this watch, especially at the price point they're coming in at. It's a really good value for money piece. I think it's a great option for someone who's maybe looking for their first mechanical watch, or you want to gift a person you know likes watches something mechanical that doesn't break the bank. This is absolutely a fun piece. I don't think it's perfect, and I think there are a lot of small little quality of life improvements they could do, namely changing that lume, making it just fully printed and almost more dressy by that fact, and not try to make it weirdly sporty with having a lume on it. It is more of a dress watch. Those tiny little things can make the watch better. I'd even pay more money if it had a slightly better movement in it, like maybe a Miota 9 series. This watch is already 80% there to being a really great watch, and something that if my cons aren't cons for you, you'll probably love it. It's a pretty good value watch, and I was very, very surprised by it in person, in hand, in my wearing experience. And realistically, if some of my cons do bother you, still check it out if you're interested, because again, it's not breaking the bank. It's a fun little almost knock around kind of watch. It's a cool watch, like I mentioned earlier, to kind of, if you want to do a little bit of modding to it, if you want to maybe try to change the dial color with like paint or some weird thing, this is the watch you can kind of accidentally mess up on or create a random masterpiece, and it doesn't feel too bad because you didn't spend too much money on it. So yeah, it's a cool project watch in a sense. But those are just my thoughts. Let me know what you think down below. Thank you as always for watching the video. Hope you got something out of it, and I'll see you in another one.